Hey yo, what's good though? Soul here, and welcome back to the story mode. So, you already know how it goes. I had a thought, and I figured I may as well relate that thought to you and see if we could have a conversation about it. Here's the thing though, it's not that this is necessarily a new conversation, it's just that it's something that we haven't really distinctly talked about, and it's also something that's kind of on the rise again a little bit, so I figured now was a better time than any to talk about this. For a very long time now, there has been an argument or an overall general consensus that Pokemon going 3D was easily one of the worst decisions it ever made as a franchise. For years upon years, probably even to this day, there were arguments and disputes and complaints generally about how the Pokemon looked. I think I mentioned this in just my previous video, but Pokemon themselves are obviously the most important aspect of the franchise. How they look, how they're animated, and how they're utilized are the most critical aspects about this franchise throughout any form of media, whether it be the games, whether it be the cards, whether it be the anime. If you're a Sonic fan, think of like the design of all of the hedgehogs or Sonic's quills conversations that you've witnessed over the years, multiply that tenfold when it comes to each and every single Pokemon. With every single generational title introduced into the franchise, they made sure to craft each and every single individual Pokemon as carefully as possible. Well, not every single one, but to a degree. When it came to the first 5 generations of Pokemon, these Pokemon were designed very intentionally for the games that they were being designed for. When designing creatures or characters for a game that is intentionally pixel or sprite based, it is very intentionally different from the outcome you would get when designing something in 3D. It wasn't all that often that major 2D or pixel-based, sprite-based titles would get the opportunity to transition into 3D, and when they did back in the day, it was extremely hit or miss because of that very fact. For example, Mario and Zelda got very lucky when transitioning because they were very careful in how they designed the 3D animations, and they made it look and still feel like those respective franchises. Unflattening the Hylian swordsman or the plumber could not have been a very easy task, but they managed to do so with very careful time and effort. Sonic, on the other hand, did not get so lucky, and there were constant disputes all the time about how Sonic also should have never transitioned to 3D, ironically. The juxtaposition from these very simple, plainly laid out 2D platforming speed sections in 2D Sonic to these massive open platforming heavy 3D levels in Sonic Adventure was jarring as hell for people. It was too much of a massive shift for a lot of people. But thankfully, because they were working with very simple concepts, they were able to really hunker down and lock in on how they wanted 3D Sonic to truly look and feel. And now we're in a better place with this franchise than ever before. Now, when it comes to Pokemon in particular, they don't necessarily have the same liberties as the franchises I've mentioned prior. And the reason I say that is because by the time that we got to 5th generation, we were already working with over 600 Pokemon. I have to imagine that on the time crunch that they were already on, for them to have to go through and even make all of the 3D models for every Pokemon that we knew up to that point had to be a damning task. But on top of that, they were working with 3D for the first time on brand new technology, so they had to learn how to work with the 3DS, build an entirely new region, build a story around it, and invent the gimmick of Mega Evolution, all within the span of maybe 2 years, if that. Now, you could absolutely argue the fact that that's not really much of an excuse for Game Freak, considering the fact that Super Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time both took maybe 2 to 3 years each. But you also might want to consider that game development in the 90s and game development in the 2010s are two very different beasts. We also need to consider the fact that Nintendo only co-owns the Pokemon games. Pokemon Company owns the other half, so how operation goes isn't completely dependent on Nintendo, who is kind of famous for not really having their developers deal with any real time crunch like that. It's absolutely zero mystery that Game Freak absolutely suffers from time crunch. So it's hard to imagine they had enough time to actually sit down with each and every single Pokemon for a long enough time to truly determine whether or not their 3D models look good. They had one task and one task only: to make the 3D models. And as we've seen throughout the years and even to this day, some models simply turned out a bit better than others. And that's just how it is. So, throughout the years and even to this day, we look to the modern generations of Pokemon and think, yeah, they're not as strong as they could be sometimes, or a lot of the time, let's be honest. And so we hear a constant recycle of the same argument time and time again. Pokemon never should have gone 3D. Now, one could easily argue that it is simply way too late. We are already looking at Pokemon Winds and Waves, and as per usual, we are looking at a fully 3D open world title. Now, thankfully, the overall consensus seems to be generally positive when it comes to how Pokemon Winds and Waves looks right now, and we still have a lot of time before we see this game again, so hopefully it looks even better by then. But every now and again, I'll see the constant residue even within my own comment section of people wanting to see those 2D based sprites again. But as I said a moment ago, it seems a little bit on the unlikely side, but not necessarily impossible. Back in 2018, we were graced with a mind-boggling game titled Octopath Traveler. On surface level, it appears to be a very simple 2D pixel-based RPG where you travel around the world utilizing a bunch of different characters and learning about their stories as you take on many different challenges and monsters. However, what was so intriguing about the game wasn't necessarily the narrative in of itself, though that was definitely a heavy part of it, but actually the graphical stylings of it. While it does use small, condensed little pixel-based sprites for its characters, the world in of itself is still 3D, but painted as if it were 2D. It also had a very heavy emphasis on the lighting, utilizing heavy saturation to brighten up this very unique design that it had for its world. For people that grew up in the very hefty era of sprite and pixel-based video games, this was definitely jarring but extremely intriguing to a lot of people. This little Square Enix team took their original concepts for a mobile title and turned it into something absolutely extraordinary. And naturally, of course, a bunch of different games spawned utilizing this very same concept. Naturally, due to its success, Octopath had to get more installments, Triangle Strategy became a thing, Live Alive got a little bit of a remake, Dragon Quest 1 through 3 got remade in this style, we just got a release for a major title with The Adventures of Elliot, The Millennium Tales, and we are looking into October with the next major release from Final Fantasy in Final Fantasy Resonance. This style that Square Enix has been publishing for the last couple of years has been come to be known officially as HD-2D. Essentially, high definition, pixel and sprite based video games. It's allowed for a lot of these games to get brand new opportunities. I really want to play through Dragon Quest 1 through 3, and I fully plan to, and I'm going to be utilizing these remakes because this is easily the best and most accessible way to do so. This is a style that me and a lot of other people have come to really appreciate and want to see happen with more projects. And so, even though Square Enix is the one pioneering this style, we can't help but look to Pokemon. And a lot of people are now constantly considering the possibility of Pokemon eventually utilizing HD-2D for a game. Now, when it comes to my personal thought process at this point in time, it's very hard for me to imagine that they would completely abandon 3D Pokemon as we know it and move forward with the generational titles or even the Legends titles utilizing HD-2D. I simply don't see that happening. However, there is one opportunity that they could utilize HD-2D and have it work wonderfully, and that would be with the Pokemon Black and White remakes. For anybody that's been following Pokemon long enough, you can definitely see the pattern, and there is absolutely no debate that we are getting Pokemon Black and White remakes likely within the next 2 to 3 years from now. However, we face a little bit of a slight issue when it comes to remakes now. Back in 2021, it was revealed to us for the first time ever that Game Freak decided to outsource a mainline generational title through the remakes, with Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl leaving it to ILCA to develop those remakes. Now, the problem that me and a lot of other people took fault with when it came to the Generation 4 remakes is that it's still not really the definitive way to play Generation 4. There's absolutely a myriad of issues that come with it, but I'll talk about that when I inevitably revisit Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. But one of the prime factors is easily the design. The style of the game feels intentional, but imperfected and unfinished. You could definitely tell that they had a plan but couldn't fully go all the way through with it when we would have certain cutscenes that would actually change camera angles and get closer to these chibi designs, and everything would be low resolution. It just generally wouldn't look too good. Again, on surface level, most people that didn't play Generation 4 likely had a phenomenal time with Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, but people like me felt a little bit more intensely about it because we still feel like Pokemon Platinum is more superior in terms of look, in terms of gameplay, in terms of content. When it comes to the remakes, nobody got shafted more than Generation 4, so of course, we were a little miffed about that at the time. Now, a lot of people probably feel very nervous going into the remakes for Generation 5, thinking, oh god, I don't think we would want it to look like this. And frankly, I kind of agree. I don't think it would be a very satisfying conclusion to have it designed this way. Frankly, 5th generation overall didn't really get a fair shake during its time of release. I feel like doing it this way and redesigning it this way, when people have developed a very hefty love for Generation 5 over the years, would essentially be shooting yourselves in the foot. Solid remakes would be the best possible way to showcase all of Generation 5's highlights that people didn't really appreciate back in the day. Obviously, going the 3D chibi 1-to-1 route is not it. People have made that abundantly clear. I can only pray that Game Freak was listening. So that being said, that leaves us with about 2 alternatives. First would be Game Freak approaching their original idea that they had with Pokemon Legends Arceus and making a fully 3D from the ground up remake of Generation 5. For anybody that's unaware, years ago when they were picking the game apart utilizing different files and going through boundaries and zones within the game, they were able to come across the original starting house in Twin Leaf Town in Legends Arceus. It's just in there somewhere, sitting on the outskirts, completely unavailable to us with zero context. Now, as far as I know, there are no official statements or interviews from Game Freak developers or higher-ups that would imply my thought process right now, but the existence of this house being here with no prior context at all leads me to believe one of 2 things. One, that house was designed and modeled to be specifically used for an in-game cutscene of the player character being dragged back through time. Or 2, Pokemon Legends Arceus initially started out as the Gen 4 remakes, a fully realized 3D open zone version of Hoenn. Now, as ideal as something like that would be, it very clearly turned out to be a much bigger task than they anticipated, which is why they completely changed up the idea and swapped Prime development over to Ilka so that they could put Prime focus into Pokemon Legends Arceus as a new concept. Now, I could ramble about this forever, but long and short of it is, the idea had to be changed because it was too big of a task. So when it comes to the Gen 5 remake, I would rather they didn't feel that rush to take on that heavy of a task when they're already working with ridiculous time crunches as it is. Maybe the last 2 breaks they've taken within the last couple of years have really helped forward development on future projects and things like that, so maybe it's not that impossible of a dream to see something like that, but again, I'm not gonna bank on that. So of course, the second alternative would be making an HD-2D remake. Next to me, I have listed a solid handful of positives and negatives that could come out of making Gen 5 Remakes HD-2D. Starting on the positive side, the first thing to note is probably the fact that this style of video game is always usually very generally favored by the public. It is by and far one of the safest styles I have seen to date. Every game so far that has had this style has developed some form of very massive fan base behind it. Even people that I know that aren't usually fond of pixel or sprite-based video games still appreciate and respect what they did with titles like this. And it just works generally so well with RPGs in particular that it wouldn't be all that out of Pokemon's wheelhouse. I have a hard time imagining anybody that could look at Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl and the HD-2D style that Square Enix has introduced and saying they would rather pick the former over the latter. So overall, I think that this style choice is a safe pick because it appeals to both new players and old players. Old players that still prefer the sprite-based pixels, or the newer players that are getting into HD-2D for the first time, likely through Pokemon. It makes a lot of sense. The second positive that I have listed here is the fact that it would likely be a bit of a cheaper alternative, and I know that probably raised a few alarm bells, but let me explain. Pokemon games and cheap usually already go hand in hand. Whenever you're playing through a modern Pokemon game, you can see the cracks. You can see where they had to take shortcuts a lot of the time just to get the game out on time. So what would be the best way to avoid having to even take these liberties? Well, if the project in of itself is a cheaper task that can be done in a much more realistic amount of time by a smaller developing team, then they could probably take a little bit more time to craft and hone in on a lot of those smaller details. During heavier dialogue, we could get stuff like high quality profile art for the characters that are important to the plot, or alternatively, we could also potentially get voice acting as well. They'd be able to spend those remaining funds on other things to generally help improve the quality of the cheaper game, making it feel higher quality. Like I said, the simplicity of it gives it a lot more breathing room to do more. So, if Pokemon could take the time, effort, and money to put into something like this, then this would be a much more grand scale project than doing something more expensive that's a little bit harder to develop, like the Gen 4 remakes that we got back in 21. And with that in mind, even if it does turn out to be one-to-one, it could still definitely go out of its way to offer something that the originals didn't. And so, going about it in that regard could really help it feel a lot more worth it as a remake. And lastly, again, it doesn't have to be Game Freak who develops this. Pokemon has already good and well proven that they are totally okay now with outsourcing other games to have developed for them, whether it be a spin-off or, even in this case, remakes. So considering that they've worked together in the past plenty of times before, I don't think it would be all that crazy for Nintendo or even straight up Pokemon Company to reach out to Square Enix for a potential project like this one. Not saying that Game Freak isn't qualified to do something like that themselves. I feel like if anybody's qualified to even attempt an HD-2D like that, it would definitely be Game Freak. But Game Freak as a company is extremely fickle. They already have different hands in different places for many different projects that we probably still don't even know about. I want all hands on deck for all of those projects within Game Freak, while they have somebody else develop something different, like the remakes, to help hold us over until the next major project following that. Now, I am positive that there are probably plenty of other developers that are more than capable of handling the HD-2D style. However, I feel like most people would feel it would be in the safest hands of a Square Enix team because they are the primary ones that have published games with this style. So they know they would probably get it right. Flipping that coin over, we definitely still have to address the negatives in the room. The first negative is primarily the fact that this is the only time we would ever be able to see something like this from Pokemon. We have to keep in mind, Generation 5 was the last major Pokemon title that used pixel and sprite-based animations. Eventually, we will reach the Generation 6 remakes, and it wouldn't really make sense to do it in this style. Alternatively, I don't see a situation in which the Legends titles or the mainline generational titles walk it back that far. I fully understand that a lot of people are very frustrated with the general quality of 3D animated Pokemon games. However, I can't see a future in which they walk it back that far. That would be insane. And if we're being completely honest here, I don't think I would want them to do that going forward. I love my nostalgia, don't get me wrong, but I also like to see new aspects, new things incorporated into Pokemon as a franchise. I want to see it grow and develop as much as possible. Them walking it back all the way to the days of 2012 or whatever, with pixel-based sprites going forward from now on, would not really be ideal for the entirety of the franchise to me. And so, like I said earlier, this is probably the only time where it would actually make sense for them to develop Generation 5 in this HD-2D style. Because you gotta remember, that's where their pixel style animations were at their peak. Actual animated movements for the sprites and everything like that would blend beautifully in HD-2D. But it's because it was sprite-based that it would work at its best here. It would simply be way too much for them to do that all over again with the Generation 6 remakes, or for Generation 11, or so on and so forth. My only other major negative here is that even if we did get these HD-2D remakes for Black and White, or miraculously moved forward with this style going forward for generational titles or Legends, it wouldn't fix Pokemon at its core. There are still a myriad of issues that are present within these games outside of just the graphical capabilities. We're still lacking major difficulty choices. We're still lacking actual acknowledgement for older players to really immerse themselves into the game. We're still lacking heavy world building with side quests and the like to help develop the world, the characters, and the overall plot. Even if HD 2D games were a thing with Pokemon going forward, we still need to delve heavily into those elements to really help Pokemon soar into the true major RPG that it's meant to be. So it doesn't really matter if we backtrack to the preferred look of the masses. At the end of the day, Pokemon still has its major core issues that need to be fixed. Graphics aren't everything to me, which is why these games are still so heavily enjoyable to me. But I do certainly feel like it could definitely help if the graphics were a little bit more interesting and better, but also if a lot of these elements were touched upon. The games being high quality 2D or low quality 3D won't really change that fact. It would be very, very neat, ideally, if we could get these Generation 5 remakes with some heavy touch-ups on some of those aspects, but something tells me we probably wouldn't get that. If we were to go to the HD-2D route, it would probably be closer to a one-to-one remake, which for the most part is fine as long as they make sure to make it the definitive and most accessible way to play Generation 5, but it wouldn't hurt to make a couple of changes and differences here and there. That would definitely help. But again, if they were to take this route, I highly doubt they would make changes that significant to it. But for the most part, that just about does it for my general positives and negatives when it comes to this concept. At the end of the day, realistically, it doesn't really matter how we receive the Generation 5 remakes, again, as long as they are the best and most efficient way to play Black and White. They absolutely deserve that much, and they deserve a proper remake. Simple as that. Even if they are to go the 3D route, great, awesome, make it fun. That's all I care about at the end of the day. As much as I know a lot of people really want them to go back to that pixel art style that we had oh so long ago, it's not gonna happen, and I really think that people just need to understand that we are still in the very, very early stages of Pokemon going truly open world. And I truly do believe that there are aspects that we have seen within these recent games of them learning lessons and progressing with how they develop games. It's just not as fast as we would like, especially when we're paying so much money for these games now. So to simply narrow down my thought process right now, essentially, I do think that it would be a good idea to use Pokemon Black and White remakes as an excuse to utilize the HD-2D styles, but I don't think anybody should get their hopes up on something like that being permanent. If they were to do that, it would be really cool, it would be really neat, and I feel like that would be the best way to pay homage to the final pixel-based video game from the Pokemon franchise before we finally move on from that and let them really take the time to cook fully true 3D titles with some high quality aspects to them. Hopefully Winds and Waves could be the next major step to that, because I really do think that it shows promise, but hey, you know what? Maybe that's just me. So that just about does it for this one. I am definitely gonna try to put out a little more content this upcoming week. I have a little bit of time on my hands, maybe, so we'll see what I could do. No promises on that. Obviously, we're gonna be continuing our Pokemon Fire Red Leaf Green Hardcore Nuzlocke this week. Definitely gonna try and stream more a little bit too if I can, although it is a holiday week, so we'll see what plays out with that. Again, like I said in my previous video, I'm gonna be a lot more active this year on my second channel. We've been streaming a couple games. I recently streamed through all of Chapter 5 of Deltarune, if anybody's interested in that. I plan to do some Yakuza stuff. I plan to do, not with the Yakuza, just the game series Yakuza, obviously. We're going to be playing Chrono Trigger very, very soon, and we're going to be doing a lot. If anybody is interested in seeing any of that or has suggestions of other games they would like me to talk about and or play live on that channel, go ahead and let me know in the Discord, which is in my description. That being said, I'm done with the ad placements here. Right, so I'm gonna go ahead and or the shameless plugging, regardless. Pass the mic over in your direction. I want you guys to tell me everything you're thinking in the comment section below. Do you agree that it would be very, very neat and kind of perfect for Generation 5 remakes to have the HD-2D style? It would work wonderfully. It would be great for everybody involved, and I think you just think it would just be generally ideal. Or are you on the opposing side? You would much rather have a fully realized 3D title with Generation 5 remakes. It would be the perfect play, and it would be a much better and more interesting way to go about it. Tell me everything you guys are thinking in the comment section below, because you know for a fact that I'm always going to be down there with you guys. But with that, yes, sir, it does appear to be Skedaddle O'Clock, so I'm going to go ahead and do just that. I'd like to thank you guys ever so much for watching. I truly do hope you enjoyed. Do me the greatest favor of dropping a like and a comment, and consider subscribing for more content just like this here. And with that, I'm gonzo. Thanks again, hope you enjoyed, and I'll be seeing you guys in the next video. Do me the greatest favor, taking good ass care, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!